Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lorraine Adams, and I'm very happy to see you here inside, in the dark practically, when it's a nice day outside. The sun may not be blazing out there, but we all know that a brutal summer is on its way. So this is a very special day that you would all come here to hear all of us speak. Just a little bit of boilerplate before we begin. On behalf of the writers, translators, and editors of PEN, it's our great pleasure to welcome you to the 11th Annual PEN World Voices Festival of International Literature. I'd like to take a moment to thank the festival sponsors and supporters, without whose generosity none of this would be possible. I'd also like to thank the more than 100 volunteers, some of whom are right outside the door, some of them are probably in here, who have given of their time to help us. There are still quite a few more festival events for you to attend. You can find the complete schedule of events at penworldvoices.org. Videos and photos of events will be posted online as soon as tomorrow. The PEN World Voices Festival brings together writers from across the globe to explore timely subjects in art, politics, and personal life. The 2015 World Voices Festival has decided for the first time to focus on a specific region this year, Africa. Although our panel will be roaming around, and actually, I don't even think we're going to Africa on this panel. Although I have written about Africa, and so has Aminata. So, but we're just not going there today. In any event, maybe it's not too early to mention that the 2016 festival will feature contemporary Mexican literature, which I have not written about. Anyway, important. Books will be available for sale at the table outside, where the authors will be available to sign copies after the event. And before I introduce each of our guests, please, could you turn off all things in your possession, which beep, ring, buzz, play musical tunes, or squeal. Even if you think you have turned them off, there's always one. So go on, take a moment, check again. A little about the format before I introduce everyone. I'll introduce the panelists, and then we're going to have a 20-minute slideshow. And that slideshow will encompass notes and photographs, books that were part of our building our particular works. In this case, there's 3 novels and a book of what I would call narrative nonfiction philosophy. And after that, we'll have 40 minutes of conversation between ourselves, and then we'll open it up for 20 minutes of questions. Okay. To my immediate right is incredibly talented young novelist. His name is Anthony Mara. And before I just settle on you, Anthony, I do want to say that I have secret crushes on all 3 of these people. Some of them date back to 2003 or 2, when I first reviewed Aminata Forna's first book, a memoir. My latest, most recent crush began last night with Carlos, where I met him at a reading, and I actually dined with this guy, okay, after having read his work and flipped out and told my husband that I might run away with this guy. Then there was Anthony Mara, who I read his book when it came out in 2012, is that the right year? 13, okay. And I just met him now, and it's already serious crushdom. So I just wanted to point that out before I go into the particulars. Just a few, just 1 or 2 sentences more. Anthony Mara has written a beautiful novel called The Constellation of Vital Phenomena. It's set in Chechnya, and no, he's not from Chechnya. He's from Washington, D.C. He did visit St. Petersburg at one point in his life, and he saw some Chechen soldiers there. As far as I know, that's the only reason he chose Chechnya, but we'll hear more about that later. In the middle here is Carlos Franco, who is an amazing and very serious philosopher. He hails from Montreal, Canada, and there's nothing in his book that's set in Montreal, Canada, is it? No. But he's actually got this hybrid past, as most of us, well, not me, but most of the people here have something of a hybrid past. He's part Brazilian, part German, and he speaks Hebrew, Arabic, Portuguese, German, English, Spanish? Spanish. Have I named them all? And French. Oh! And despite that, he's incredibly nice. And his book is called Teaching Plato in Palestine, and it is an amazing book about taking people who are unlikely subjects for philosophical debate and teaching them philosophy. He travels not only to Palestine, but to Indonesia, Brazil, an Iroquois reservation. I've probably left something out, but forgive me for now. The last person is the one I have the most secret and deep crush on, and that's Aminata Forna. Aminata first broke into the literary world when she wrote The Devil That Danced on Water, which was her memoir of her father and her upbringing in Sierra Leone. Her father was assassinated for political reasons, and the book that she wrote was phenomenal. She then went on to write 3 more novels. Is it right? 3? Okay. And the 2 novels were set in Sierra Leone, and the final novel that just came out was set in Croatia, and that is called The Hired Man. The Hired Man is the novel we're going to be focusing on most of all today. So that's it for now. And now I'm supposed to say to my stage manager, can you please turn on the slideshow? Oh, how nice. There it is. There's the name of the panel and our names. Okay, now I go like this. Okay, do I put this down? I don't know how to make, is it this? What's the thing I have in here? Oh, that's the only one I didn't push. Okay, so I'm going to stand up while I do this because I want to take a look at what you're looking at, and I want to give you a moment to just read what I have up on the screen here. The first 3 slides are going to be about my novel, The Room in the Chair, which was basically a novel about the so-called global war on terror. And before I wrote the book, I went to Afghanistan. And part of my practice is that I take photographs before it's a note-taking device. I'm not a great photographer, but this photograph is from a wedding that I happened on in western Afghanistan, about 40 minutes outside Herat, near the Iranian border. And this wedding party, they were all running and in jeeps and buses, and they basically said, "Come to our wedding." And I was there with my guide, and he said, "Sure." So I went to this Afghanistan wedding, and these are the little girls who were in the wedding, and this informed a passage in my book, because the protagonist in my book is a female fighter pilot from the United States, and she is flying an F-16, and she's bombing places in Afghanistan, and she actually bombs a wedding. And that, what you see up there is the passage, because someone gives her, after the bombing, the photographs of these little girls, and she realizes that these are the people that she's actually killed. So also part of my novel was not just going to Afghanistan, but going to Iran. And you can see here that these are my notes. Yeah, they're pretty unreadable, aren't they? But I will say that if you look over here, you can see my really bad drawing of a nuclear what was a nuclear facility in Iran. And I wasn't allowed to take photographs of it because there were mean, nasty men there. And my guide said, if you put your camera anywhere but on the floor, we'll be in big trouble. So I also talked about the herd of sheep, the various colors. As you can see, it's kind of a hodgepodge. And then this is the passage in the book where one of my characters, who's an Iranian nuclear physicist, goes to work. And then the final slide is a book that I read prior to going to Iran, and it's called Passenger to Tehran by Vida Sackville-West, who, before I was researching this, I had no idea that Vida Sackville-West had ever gone to Iran. And one of the things I loved about her book was the way in which she kind of demystified this very exotic place called Persia, which of course is the ancient name for today's Iran. And I won't dwell on this all that long, but one of the things I really enjoyed about it is that when she says, resignation is essential here if one does not wish to live in a condition of perpetual fury. Then, having emptied the mind of European preconceptions, one is at liberty to turn round and absorb an entirely new set of conditions. And I think that's kind of the theme of what we're talking about this afternoon, is the way in which you set aside your preconceptions and you enter into an experience that is fully foreign, and enjoy that, not resist that. And one of the things I learned about when I was traveling in Iran is how everyone likes to talk about having sex with their wife. Now, it took me a long time to figure this out, of course. This didn't happen on day one. But I had a driver and a guide, and we were driving for like 10 hours, 5 hours. I mean, I've spent months with these guys, and they were always speaking Farsi, and I was, scribbling in the back. And then finally, by like the second trip, the second year I was there, I said to the guide, I had the same guide, I said, what are you guys talking about? I said, fucking our wives. I said, really? He said, yeah, we're talking about how interesting it is and the different things that happen and then what his friends do and what his other friends do. And he said, I really feel bad about, that, Americans have to rely on pornography because it's so much more fun to talk to your friends about it. So that was something I incorporated into my book. So moving right along. Hoping for more laughs on that, but no one did. Okay. I'm now going to hand the microphone to Anthony, or he has a microphone, and I'd like you to just tell us a little bit about this slide. Oh, it's yours. Oh, I'm so sorry, Aminata. Okay. Do you have to? Yeah.
Now, let me look at which one you're using. Let me read the top. When I approached the hired man, what I did was I did a recce of part of Croatia where the particular war I was writing about, the war in the Krajina, had taken place. And a friend of mine who's a war correspondent had given me a little map of where to start and where to go. I flew into Dubrovnik just because it was a cheap thing to do. And then headed north to Knin, which is where the war began. And then I travelled along that line of the border and down to Split. The countryside is just astonishingly beautiful in Croatia. I don't know if anyone's ever been there. it is astonishingly beautiful, and at the same time, the scars of the war, which had really been cleaned up on the coast. So on the coast, there were lots of people on holiday, lots of tourists, lots of big boats coming into Havana. But on the just an hour's drive in the interior, the place was really very badly scarred. And I think also there was political decision making about who got rebuilt and who didn't. So from Kinin on, it was really very scarred, but at the same time incredibly beautiful. And there were one or two things I noticed that later on, or that people had pointed out to me, or that I noticed that I began to make sense of. One was the absence of a certain church in a village. So there would usually be a Serbian Orthodox church, and there would be the church that the Croats prayed at, and one would have been destroyed in the war. And the other thing was the two bakeries. There were two different kinds of bakeries with different names, and depending on what had happened in the war, one of them would very often be destroyed by the other side because they were emblematic of the other ethnicity and culture. Now, the other thing I noticed as I was driving through was, along with this incredibly beautiful countryside, which was full of wild flowers, and really very much unlike anything else in Europe, I stopped and I was going to have a wander in this meadow, actually. And when I got there, I realised it was a minefield, and most of the mines hadn't been cleared yet. And all these would have been fields of wheat and potatoes and agricultural crops, and they had gone fallow since the war. People were no longer able to farm them. So I'll just finish off by saying, one of the reasons I went to Croatia is because my family had lived so much through the war in Sierra Leone, and I knew how to read Sierra Leone anyway from growing up there so much, and I knew how to read the effect of war and the aftermath of war and what it had done to the place and to the people. And I really wanted to go to a place that I didn't know and try and put myself in the position of, say, a visitor to Sierra Leone who doesn't understand what has happened and what the effect has been. And one of my main characters is just such a person who comes from Britain. And here we are in the cemetery. Now, I can't remember exactly, because I took pictures of quite a few cemeteries, and I can't remember exactly where this one is, but what you find in the cemeteries is that the cemetery is split up according to the ethnicities in the town. The Serbs have part of it, and the Croatians have another part of it, and the ethnic Croatians have another part. And people, there's something of a death culture there. People, you find women on the weekends, on Sundays, coming and cleaning the graves. And it was remarkable how many of them were of young men. I mean, actually he was born in 1912, so he's not one, but young men who'd fallen in the war. And of the previous war, so what you'd find in the war of, in the Second World War, the men who had fought on Tito's side, and the communists, all had a little gold star. And it had at one point during the Croatian War, because of the rise of the right wing, become something that what would happen is that the women would go and they would scratch out the little gold star. So there were all these little signs and interpretations that I had to learn.
Yeah, okay. So as Lorraine mentioned, I organized these philosophy workshops in different places around the world. And the first took place at Al-Quds University, which is a Palestinian university in East Jerusalem. And we started the class by reading texts by Plato. And one of the texts by Plato that we read was the Republic. And so here what you have is an excerpt from the second book of the Republic, where Plato proposes a very simple thought experiment which allows the reader to figure out whether he values justice for its own sake or only for its consequences. So are we just because we are afraid of punishment for being unjust, or because we want the rewards for being just? Or are we actually just because we value justice as something that is intrinsically good? Plato speaks about a kind of magical ring that you can put on, and that allows you to commit whatever injustice you like without having to fear any kind of punishment. And so the question is, if you have that ring, will you continue to be just, or will you then just go crazy and sleep with your neighbor's wife? That's one of the examples that Plato actually gives for injustice. That triggered a very interesting discussion with my Palestinian students, who were all pious and observant Muslims, obviously, but it got them thinking about why they were actually so committed to Islam. So was it because they found some intrinsic value in Islam, or was it only because they wanted to secure, a spot in heaven or avoid, burning eternally in hell? So we had a very interesting discussion about that, and I remember one student in particular who was very meticulous in her observance. So she showed photos around from a festivity that she participated once, and some of the photos I and the other men in the class weren't allowed to see because she appears in them without the hijab. And so this girl, Bisma was her name, she actually said that if injustice comes without punishment, then she would actually prefer injustice over justice. So so it got her thinking about her commitments. So yeah, this is so the same context. So we started with Plato. So again, Al-Quds University, so we started with Plato, and then we went to medieval Muslim and Jewish philosophers who pick up on Plato and propose something like a philosophical interpretation of Islam and Judaism. And so the idea was to think with the students in general about the relationship between reason, politics, and religion, and also to kind of open a new perspective on the Middle East, on things that are going on in the Middle East from this kind of particular vantage point. What you see here is basically the cover of the final paper that was submitted by one of the students, together with my comments and also with the grade. And as you can see, this was a mid-range student who got 70 out of 100, so it was not the best student, but also not the worst student. The topic that the student wrote about, so he compared Plato's political philosophy to the political philosophy of Al-Farabi, who is one of the first important medieval Muslim philosophers who builds on Plato to provide a kind of philosophical interpretation of Islam. So this was the topic of this final paper.
Moving now to
to Akwesasne, yeah. So so the last workshop in this series took place in a Mohawk reservation, so a Native American community in Akwesasne, so that's the name of the place. And so Akwesasne is on the border between Canada and US. And if you read something about Akwesasne in the media, the only thing you will read about is that it's a hotbed of smuggling, so ecstasy, and from ecstasy to human beings. So that's what the media picks up on. And so we had a really very interesting workshop there, which was focused on fundamental questions in political philosophy. So this community was negotiating a self-governance agreement with the Canadian government, and it saw this self-governance agreement as a first step towards regaining sovereignty. So many of these Native American communities want to become sovereign nations again, and so self-governance was one important step in that direction, and that reopened some of the most fundamental questions of political philosophy. Who should rule? With what purpose? How do you secure good rulership? Who is a member of the community, and so on. So much of the discussions that we had in Akwesasne were around these questions that were really live questions for the community at the time, and there was a wide range of views within the community on how to proceed. And so so it was a really exciting opportunity to think about these issues in a kind of real life context where they were really urgent and alive.
This was about the different conceptions of courage.
Right. Yeah. So one of the sessions in Akwesasne with this Mohawk or Iroquois community was devoted to the question, how one should live, concepts of the good life. And one of the things that they very much value traditionally is courage, the virtue of courage. And so I asked them if courage is actually something that is good in itself, or does it require something else to make it good? And I gave them these two pictures to bring out the strength of this question. So on the picture to the left, you see Samuel de Champlain, who set up the colonial administration, the French colonial administration in the French part, the French colony in Canada, and who was a very courageous person. He confronted the Iroquois and shot many of them, and I think he can be described as a courageous person. But obviously, they didn't want to actually use this kind of positive value term to describe Samuel de Champlain, but they were happy to attribute courage to this Iroquois warrior who is on the right side confronting a Canadian soldier in the so-called Oka crisis in the early 1990s, which was one sort of important manifestation of this project to regain sovereignty. And so, we asked the question, do you need something like wisdom or something that, directs courage in a certain direction, in addition to courage, to actually make it a virtue?
Thank you. I'll get up if that's okay, so I can see as well. The photograph is taken outside of the Tolstoy Museum in northern Chechnya, and the excerpt on the right is the final page of Haji Murat, which was the last book that Tolstoy ever published. It's set in Chechnya, and among many Chechens, it's sort of revered as being one of the great works of this Chechen conflict. On the left is a excerpt from my novel in which one character is trying to get another character to read the book, but that character doesn't want to because she's read the last page and sees it's a bit depressing. But Tolstoy, his entire career was bookended by Chechnya. He began writing his first novel, Boyhood, while he was in Chechnya in the 1850s, and he comes back to Chechnya in fiction, at least, for his final book. And this statue is outside of this museum called the Tolstoy Museum that I visited. It's built in this town, Starogladovskaya, where he was stationed, and it was the only museum to stay open during both the First and Second Chechen War, and it was able to remain open because the curator would sit outside with a shotgun every day, warding off any non-Tolstoy enthusiasts. And that statue was built after the museum was partially restored. This is connected with the following slide as well. This is an excerpt from a book called Allah's Mountains, and it's by a British journalist named Sebastian Smith. I wrote my novel before actually visiting Chechnya. I visited in the very last phase of working on it, in large measure because it's a difficult place to get to, and I was in my mid-20s and had no institutional support or connections or anything like that. But this excerpt describes the effects of the deportation that occurred in 1944 in Chechnya. Stalin was worried that the coming German forces into the Caucasus would find support among the Chechens, and so his answer was to deport the entire republic to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Siberia. And when they came back 13 years later, after Khrushchev came to power, they came to a country that had been a land area that had been repopulated by Russians, and their tombstones were pulled out of cemeteries and used to pave roads. This is actually an example of that. On the right-hand side, you see a cemetery that is still intact. This is in the highlands by the Dagestan border. There's no paved roads going up there. It's a little difficult to get there, and these tombstones in this particular cemetery were unscathed. On on the left-hand side, you see several broken tombstones. And those were actually collected by a man named Adam Satuyev. And he went around trying to collect these fragmented tombstones, and he sort of pieces them together in his garden. And he spent the entire war, the entire conflict, basically rebuilding these pieces of the past. This was part of it, but he also rebuilt his destroyed childhood village in his backyard, this replica of it. And he would go to the mountains and he would quarry these beautiful white stone blocks, and he would build these 2- and 3-story tall watchtowers that once studded the highlands. And he built a system of irrigation canals and a whole series of houses. And no one lives in this replica village. It's peopled only by his ghosts. But the no, that is something different. This was attached to the tombstone to the cemetery. This is a village that whose residents were forced to move out of the highlands down into the plains following the consolidation of power of the Soviet Union. And that on the left was my guide, Elena, and on the right is a hieroglyph, which were these ancient markings that you find often in these older homes.
All right. So to turn it off, say turn it off. Yeah. Please turn it off.
Can you hear me? Please turn it off. Thanks. Okay. So, I want to open up the discussion with a few questions. And I guess I'll pose it to the panel at large, and whoever wants to answer can. Why do we think that philosophy, literature, art can trigger understanding or present a more profound understanding of social or violent conflict?
I'll go. I think I went through 3 transitions. I started as a journalist, then I wrote a memoir, and then I turned to fiction. And there was a reason for that, which is the answer to this question, is that with fiction, what I have endeavoured to do a couple of things. I tried to get my reader to walk the walk with the character. And with fiction, you can do something which you cannot do with journalism and you cannot do with non-fiction. I mean, with a memoir, to a certain extent, I can go inside my own head because I'm the narrator. But with fiction, you can go inside the head of all the characters. And so when I write a novel, that is, to me, the most profound importance, is the ability to go inside the head of a character and to imagine what somebody else is thinking and to imagine how they might arrive at the way in which they think. So that, for me, is one very good reason why fiction does it. The other, I mean, with my novels in particular, I don't know if this is true of every fiction writer, but I think it's true of those who are my favourite. I tend to start off with a question that I want to answer. Now, if the question arrives fully formed, I feel pretty good, but it doesn't. It usually takes me pretty much the whole of the novel to figure out what the question is and what the answer might be to that question. Sometimes there's more than one question, but I can kind of hone it down. So I would say that The Devil That Danced on the Water, the question was, how does a country implode? Right? How does a country collapse? With Ancestor Stones, it was really about how the individuals' lives are affected by big P politics in ways that they don't even know or appreciate. With The Memory of Love, it was very much about the line between complicity and being so-called apolitical. When does doing nothing become part of the problem? What is complicity? So there's a character called Elias Cole, and he's telling his story, and what I asked the reader to do is really to try and figure out, is Elias Cole lying? And if he is, or is he lying to himself? And what would you do in the same circumstance? And with the hired man, I'd say the question is what happens when the fighting is over. It's very much about the aftermath of war. Because I write so much about civil conflict, I was very struck by how different conflict was experienced and understood by people who lived in countries where conflicts were fought overseas. I live in London. Britain has been engaged in several wars, but it hasn't had a war fought on its own soil for a very, very long time. And the same is true of this country. So war for people in those countries is very much an experience really of the returning veterans. And you see how, here, both here in Britain, veterans have a very particular place as a result of the sacrifice they've made. But you're not at war with your neighbour. Someone didn't take your house, someone didn't rape your son or your daughter, you haven't given up your village. So conflict in those countries where actually when the fighting is over and if there has been outside intervention, that has withdrawn, what is left? How long do those feelings continue, and how do they resonate, and how do they play out?
Yeah, I think philosophy is actually quite different from literature, right? Because you don't really inhabit the characters that you're in conversation with. But I do think that philosophy can do basically two things in conflict zones. And so you mentioned these different workshops that are organized in different hotspots around the world. And obviously, these were all places fraught with conflict, but conflicts of quite different kinds. So I think my concept of conflict is somewhat broader. So, we have the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Islam and the West, but also something like piety and seclusion versus urban modernity. So I did one workshop with a group of Hasidic Jews here in New York, right? So it's a different kind of conflict. Social and racial divisions in Brazil, obviously the scars of colonialism. And these kinds of conflicts, they give rise to fundamental questions, right? So does God exist? Is piety actually worth it? We talked about this just now. Is violence justified? What is social justice? How can we get there? How should we deal with the legacy of colonialism? And what I think philosophy can do is relatively modest, I would say. I think it can offer tools to clarify these kinds of questions and to explore and refine answers to them. So I think it's not philosophy's place to give answers, but it can help people to think about these questions in an intelligent way and explore answers to them. I can maybe give you an example of how this actually worked out in practice. So this question of, is violence justified? So I don't think there's a clear-cut answer to that. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. So I co-taught this class at Al-Quds University with Sari Nusseibeh, who is a prominent Palestinian intellectual and philosopher, and he's also an advocate of non-violent resistance to the occupation in Palestine. And non-violent resistance is not a very popular concept in Palestine, right? So human beings as they are, you get hit, you want to hit back. So it's understandable, but what he argues is that given the way Israelis are, if they were faced with non-violent demonstrations, they would probably, or the majority would probably realize that continuing the occupation is not justified, and in addition, this will secure the entire world's sympathy for the Palestinian cause. So he presents non-violent resistance as the most efficient means to reach the goal that all Palestinians want to reach, namely ending the occupation and getting some form of political sovereignty. And so it's what reason, as it were, prescribes, right? Because it's the most efficient way of getting to what you want. And so we had a very interesting discussion about this when we read, again, Plato's Republic. So one of the most important virtues for Plato is what he calls sophrosyne, which is self-control in English. And so Plato thinks, the human soul has a rational part, but it also has these irrational emotions and impulses. And if we don't have self-control, then these irrational emotions will often push us to do things that are unwise, right? Eating another piece of chocolate cake, even though you know it's not good for your health, and so forth. So the idea we discussed was, can this virtue, sophrosyne, self-control, maybe help to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because it enables people to choose non-violent resistance, which is the best way of getting to your goal, rather than hitting back and perpetuating the circle of violence. I think it's an interesting.
Although if you ask people in the Green Revolution in Iran about violent protest. It got them absolutely nowhere. And also the Chinese in Tiananmen
Right.
Square. So
Yeah.
there's lots of
Yeah.
examples in which it is not.
Yeah, I would.
But I mean, I still understand what you're saying about the value of reasonable debate as a way to illuminate conflict in the way that the novel's imaginative strategy of getting inside people's heads illuminates conflict.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
in a slightly
And I
similar way.
completely agree with you that I would definitely not want to present nonviolent resistance as a kind of panacea. I think you really have to look at the particular conflict you're dealing with. So in South Africa it didn't work. In Nazi Germany it wouldn't
Right,
work.
and that's part of your book, is that there are these records of conversations, so that you're not asserting nonviolence will always work, but you're talking about the ways in which people have conversations about
Exactly.
that.
It's tied to a very specific political and historical moment.
I would say that for fiction, at least, I think it gives the ability for a reader to personalize stories that are often incredibly depersonalized when we meet them in the news media. That probably most of us have had the experience of flipping through a newspaper and you see, a single paragraph about a bombing somewhere where 20 people died, and you get that number 20. And I think numbers are incredibly difficult to see in any kind of complexity or to empathize with or to care about. And I think that as was said earlier, that fiction gives you the ability to try to understand a single or half dozen lives. And you're not talking about these large figures. You're talking about very small, intimate moments in people's lives. And I think that the ability to present those moments, to present people not as casualty figures, but as suffering, joyous, troubled, disturbed, and funny individuals, can do more to generate a sense of what it might be like to be there than to simply go through a long list of those who have died.
I think the imagination has this incredibly useful habit of storytelling, and storytelling enables empathy. And with empathy, you're able to stop numberizing people, if I can make that into a verb. And it's also like the conversations that you have between, a Westerner and someone in Al-Quds University. So I think that constant facing the other, whoever that other may be, and speaking to them and having a discourse is a lot like when you are inside the head of one of Aminata's characters, who's Croatian, and you come to see some of the horrible things he's done, and also some of the valiant and heartbreaking things. And you see him in his fullness, not just in his one-dimensionality. So I want to ask, I think what I was trying to do with the slideshow was to also raise the question of, do these notes and photographs and research go anywhere towards making our work more authentic? Is authenticity about local knowledge, gathered from traveling to the place of the conflict? Tony Marr didn't even go to Chechnya before he wrote, although he certainly read a lot. Is it our engagement beyond the usual as authors that makes for authenticity? In other words, here is Aminata Forna, who was, a native of, again, your father's Scottish. No, your mother's Scottish, and your father was Sierra Leone. She's very aware of borderlands. She's aware of violence. So is it her engagement with Croatia, given her lifetime experience, what makes it authentic? Or is it the fact that she almost walked into a field of flowers that were bombed?
Well, I mean, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because there are two answers that I see. One is that actually novels and are works of the imagination. first and foremost. Otherwise, write non-fiction, right? And read non-fiction. A novel is a work of the imagination. So the actual setting of the novel, to me, is not the most important thing. It is the characters. That's the most important thing. What you want to do is not get it wrong. You have to create a world. And years ago, when I was in Lorraine's position, I interviewed Vikram Seth before I began to write. And he had just published a book set in the world of classical music. And I asked him how he went about it. He wasn't a classical musician. And he said, well, the important thing to me was that the people in that world were convinced by it. And so that was what was important to me, that you could be Croatian, read the book and be convinced by it. And so I did several things to make that happen. You know, I had 2 close Croatian friends who helped me a lot. You know, every time I wanted an answer to something, a word, or, you know, there's a lot of Croatian history that's not, social history that's not written, like what TV programs in the 1970s. You know, I'd have to ring one of them up and say, what were the TV programs in the 1970s? What did your mother make you when you got the flu? So all these little details, and that's the attempt to put in enough authenticity that the reader inhabits that universe and believes it. And you put in something wrong, and what you do, the reader comes up short and thinks, hang on a minute, that doesn't feel convincing. So, you know, those are the reasons. But I would also say that, you know, we're very obsessed with difference at the moment, difference and authenticity. And I thought that Croatia and Sierra Leone were rather alike, actually. And interestingly, so did a lot of the Croatians. It seemed to be the British who thought we were so different. So we would talk together about the British and what they didn't understand. The similarities I saw were small countries, right? Roughly the same land size, roughly the same population size, an economy that's agricultural. Small communities, village-based, religious, right? They had all those things in common. They also had a coastline. They were physically incredibly beautiful, although that's not what you saw in the war years. And both of them had lived under decades of dictatorship. These seem to me very strong similarities. And I wrote a piece recently called Don't Judge a Book by Its Author, talking about this question of authenticity and who gets to write what, you know. And one of the things I did in it was, I was reading, his name always goes out of my head, wrote Outliers, Tipping Point, Malcolm Gladwell. I was reading Malcolm Gladwell, and there was this rather fascinating examination of airplane crashes and how some airlines were suffering a lot of crashes. And one of the things they did was bring in cultural anthropologists, social anthropologists, psychologists to figure out what was going on in the cockpit between the pilot and the co-pilot that was causing these very avoidable crashes to happen. And one of the things, now you have to read that for yourself, but one of the things he did was point to a piece of research by an anthropological psychologist called the Hofstede Dimensions. Does anyone know about these? Well, what the Hofstede Dimensions do is they cover a large number of countries. I forget, it's about 40 countries or more, and they look at different elements. I think there are 6 in all. And they look at different elements of how people in these countries respond to different things, like risk, ambiguity was one. And so what in Gladwell's piece, one of the things he described was how, on a certain level, it was ambiguity in particular, the ability to tolerate uncertainty. Danes could tolerate a very high degree of uncertainty, but the Belgians couldn't. And yet they were very close to each other. But the Jamaicans, on the other hand, could tolerate as much ambiguity as the Danes. So the Danes and the Jamaicans were very much alike in this, and the Belgians and the Danes. So it really doesn't matter what you look like or which part of the world you inhabit. You know, there are other elements. So out of interest, when I was writing this piece, I looked up the Hofstede Dimensions, and I took Sierra Leone and Croatia and Britain. Sierra Leone and Croatia, like that. Britain, not so much. Britain's completely different. So actually, that to me, I mean, that work was done by a psychologist, but that to me is what writers do. We know, or we try to see beyond what is there. And we know that the way things look on the surface isn't necessarily the way they are.
love that. And I also think whenever I was looking at some of these slides and some of these photographs, and then I would read the work that you guys had written, I was thinking, there's nothing here in this photograph that's really all that interesting. I mean, this is like the most boring photograph I've ever seen. It looks like some grass. I mean, and then, you know, you read the passage that she wrote, and it's absolutely thunderingly interesting. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. Okay, did you?
I think
Tony.
I think it's a great question and a difficult one. I feel like asking writers to sort of judge their own authenticity is a bit like asking high school students to grade their own tests. But for me in particular, it was a question that I really struggled with, because I'm not Chechen. I have no familial connection to the place, and sort of everything that I've come to believe historically and culturally and intellectually leads me to believe that I can't possibly imagine what it would be like to be someone in this conflict. And everything I believe artistically, though, says that it is possible to imagine, and I sort of hold them both to be equally true. And that friction is where I think much of the challenge and shortcomings of writing the book came from, I think. And I was thinking about this earlier, and this question of what makes something authentic. And my dad fought in the Vietnam War, and were he to write a novel about it, it would not be anywhere near as good as Tree of Smoke by Dennis Johnson, who didn't fight in the Vietnam War. And little sort of ideas like that sort of kept me somewhat ethically okay with pursuing this book. And when as a reader, you know, what makes a book feel authentic is less having the right tree in the right place. You know, I think it's if you can at all possible. If it's at all possible to get that right tree in the right place, you should. But it's the characters that make a book authentic. It's having
Which is what Amanada said.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, Carlos.
Yeah. I guess my situation is almost the opposite of Tony's. So all the places I went to, I actually did have either biographical connection or scholarly connection. So you know, my family is Brazilian, so I went to Brazil. I've lived many years in Jerusalem. You know, I've learned Arabic and Hebrew as scholarly languages and so forth. So I had some, you know, cultural competence to moderate the discussions, but in a sense I was really not striving for authenticity in the sense of inhabiting the characters and really adopting their perspective, but I was, you know, deliberately going into these discussions as a foreigner who, in a benevolent way, wanted to challenge and be challenged, right? So the idea was to, you know, start something like what I like to call a culture of debate. So a kind of intellectual space where you can have real discussions across cultural and religious divides about things that are very important to us, but about which we fundamentally disagree. So, you know, speaking of conflict zone, in a certain sense, I'm in favor of conflict as long as it doesn't turn into, you know, violent conflict, but is really transformed into this culture of debate. Because I think what I see as the main benefit of leaving this otherness in place, what I see as the main benefit of that is that we have a chance to, you know, critically reflect on the core convictions that we were brought up with, that we have internalized, that we often take for granted, especially when we only talk to people that we
Who are exactly
that we
like
know.
us. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, I'd love to talk more, but it's time to open up this panel to questions from the audience. So I don't know how this works. Do they
Shout out from the audience.
just shout out?
Raise their hand.
Raise your hand, and I'll.
Repeat it if everyone can't hear it.
All right. So if you could raise your hand and just shout it out, and if we can't hear you, I'll repeat it. Thank you. Go ahead.
So I live in Brussels, which is the capital of Europe, and very recently, as you're aware,
You need to speak much louder. No one back there can hear you.
inundation of images of drowning people fleeing from Northern Africa. world where we ignore, in fact, the origins of the situations we find ourselves in because it's too difficult for us to digest. So how do you, as representatives of artists or philosophy or journalists or personal experience, process that for us to understand and hold?
Oh boy.
You did that for comfort.
No. Did you all hear that? Oh, thank God. Okay.
I mean, I think.
Do you want us to repeat the question?
Can you use
you repeat
the
the question?
microphone in the audience? We
Yeah,
can't
I
hear
think we're going to
anything.
have to do that. No?
Just repeat the
You're shaking your head, Mr. Manager.
You have to give up one.
Oh, I see.
Just repeat the question.
All right, I'm going to try to repeat the question. She's talking about how there are many refugees from North Africa trying to reach Europe, and of course, they're dying on the high seas, or they're being. A little boy was found in a suitcase, I think, a night ago. The desperation of these people, and that there's a tendency to, on the part of the media, I guess, and all of us, when we talk about these things, to overlook or not want to understand the origins of these events that are quite dramatic, because it's too difficult, it's too complex. We can't even be bothered to learn about the individual conflicts in Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco. Is that what you're saying? So how would we, as novelists or philosophers, how would we make it possible to understand the origins better? Is that your question? Okay.
Yeah, maybe literature and philosophy.
Can you hold it up to your mouth
Yeah,
more?
maybe literature and philosophy can complement each other. So literature, as Tony had said earlier, can in some sense bring depth to the numbers, right? And can make the pain and the suffering somehow palpable. And I think philosophers will pick up questions about, for example, global justice, right? So this is a very important discussion right now in philosophy, and which obviously is relevant. Questions about global governance and so forth, which hopefully can point to ways of alleviating some of these problems that generate these catastrophes. I have a very good friend, Ahmed Ghazali, who is a francophone writer from Morocco, who wrote actually a play exactly about these refugees trying to set over from North Africa to Spain, and it brings home the problem in a very striking way, and philosophy in some sense can pick up on that. And then
My first novel, Harbor, is about Algerian stowaways who leave North Africa on natural gas tankers and spend 52 days in the hold and then jump off into Boston Harbor and swim ashore. And it's about the Algerian, the origins of that impulse. That's what the book is all about. And there are other books that are about the immigrant experience. Some of them are more palatable, like Jhumpa Lahiri's. Some of them are more violent and more extreme. But there are many novels, there's a whole kind of genre of novels that are about exactly what you talked about.
Well, I'm going to take it from a slightly different perspective, which is, it is what I do in my books, is try to join the dots. Where things start, where they go, where they end. So with a conflict, how many million small acts create the environment for the conflict, and then the conflict itself. It's what you put your finger on is the very reason I left journalism.
And the reason I left too.
I became so frustrated with the short form, and with that disinclination to go behind the story and to really tell why these things happened and how they came to be. But I think also the other thing was I also found journalism very cowardly for its refusal to confront the viewer with that question. We would ask for sympathy, or we would presume sympathy if we showed people who were hurt or dying, but we would never confront the viewer with the question, and I worked for the BBC television, we never confronted the viewer with difficult questions. And I would sometimes ask my editor, well, surely we should be doing this. We should ask, what is the role? I mean, for example, here's a whole other one. You know, with the National Health Service in Britain, which we're so proud of course it's extremely expensive. And we used to do story after story after story on the National Health, and there would be people wanting different kinds of treatment on the National Health, very expensive treatments, or perhaps treatments that were cosmetic because you know, their big nose had caused them so much pain during their life. And so everyone was asking for something. And you know, at no point when we were holding these discussions on television would the interviewer say, okay, what are you going to lose? What are you going to lose if you want this? Who's not going to get something? And it was, I just think it was a moral cowardice. I used to ask this question all the time. I mean, it is somewhat beginning to be asked more about the NHS now, because we really have reached a crisis point. But you know, there was a sort of moral cowardice. There's a great deal of courage in journalism very often, but sometimes a kind of moral cowardice about confronting people with the implications, all the implications that might also imply some responsibility on their own part.
Another question?
I'd like to follow up on what you just said.
I have to call on you, though, and I didn't call on
Oh,
you. Go ahead. I just don't want there to be chaos later.
I think you have reified journalism. By reify, I mean you've turned a concept into a thinking, acting being with a will and the ability to be a coward. Journalists are one thing. Journalism is something else. People are cowards.
Is there a question here?
Yeah. How is journalism a coward? I don't see cowardice as being something journalism as a concept can.
Okay, so is journalism a coward? I think that you know, having spent 20 years in journalism and been a reporter at the Washington Post, I can say that, you know, it definitely has moments when difficult questions are simply not addressed. I mean, I lived through 9/11, and I remember there was a basic laying down of thoughtfulness on the part of the media at the highest levels, the New York Times in particular. So I think cowardice is definitely something that can be attributed to the media. You know, not all the time, but sometimes. Another question? Yes.
Yeah, I would just like to expand that a little bit, if you would address the issue not just of cowardice, but the issue of journalists acting as sycophants. And
I really don't want this to turn into a discussion about journalism.
But I want to explain
about.
that because it's one of the virtues of fiction, which is when one is able to get into a character's head and discuss this kind of stuff, which you don't do it and really elaborate on it, because there's sometimes a lot more truth in anything that's fiction in terms of any controversial event, whether it be Sierra Leone, the Kennedy assassination, or whatever else. It's best sometimes described in a work of fiction like Don DeLillo does, rather than, and again, it's again to the point Ms. Forna raised before, that fiction really allows you to get inside the character's head, particularly in a culture like ours.
Okay, is there a question in this?
Yeah, I mean, question, if you could, if the panelists could elaborate more on the virtues of fiction, particularly when it comes to very controversial events in a nation's history.
Okay, Anthony, do you want to take that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that there's bad fiction as much as bad journalism. I wouldn't necessarily put fiction on a higher pedestal. In terms of dealing with controversial material, in at least my own experience writing about Chechnya, I think the idea that you remove authorial judgment from the material that you're presenting, and you simply let your characters and their stories unfold before the reader, and let the reader judge if they must judge for themselves.
Another question? Yes, with the glasses and the streak in your hair, which I love. Wait, we need to give you a mic. You're very soft-spoken.
I was very interested in knowing more about your experiences that you've had in cross-cultural discussions, whether with students in different countries or just, you know, with other writers, with other thinkers. So any experiences on how to engage in them, what your experiences have been when you did engage in them, and so on.
Great question. Carlos?
Yeah. So I held my book in hands for the first time yesterday evening. So I haven't actually gotten feedback on the book itself, but I did always send back the chapters as I was writing them to the groups with which I had been working to get feedback, and because I didn't want to misrepresent them. And what I found interesting is that the feedback was pretty much consistently actually positive. So my Hasidic Jews, my Hasidic students complained that I hadn't emphasized enough the intellectual sharpness and how much they outsmarted me. So I had to revise that chapter a little bit. But in general, it was positive, and I think the reason for that is that all the groups that I worked with, they have a problematic reputation. They have often a negative media presence for whatever reason. They are represented as fundamentalists or jihadists. They're represented as religious sectarians. They're represented as thieves or drug dealers in Brazil. They're represented as smugglers, as I mentioned in Akwesasne. And in these chapters, they appear suddenly as philosophers, not as thieves and smugglers and fundamentalists. And you can sort of get a sense for the complexity and the richness of the issues that they're facing, and the sophisticated discussion that they're having about these issues. And I think they appreciated that. I don't know if this is. I think that is maybe in a certain way a contribution to authenticity. So it sheds a very different light on these groups, which, however, I think brings out a truth that is normally not visible.
Yes, with your hand up with the blonde hair.
Yeah. I guess we all know that, when we were talking about journalism, it's supposedly objective, but we all know the Washington Post and the Nation, the New York Times all have a different bias and point of view, even though they're trying supposedly to be objective. But when you get into fiction, or even the kind of philosophical debates you have in books, we're allowed to selectively determine, our bias. On how,
we as readers or we as authors?
No, as authors, we're allowed to determine our bias because, I'll read a mystery story. I'll be able to tell something about the person's political points of view in there, usually. There's always a bias of sorts. How much was that part of your choosing to use that form that you wanted to express it more from your own point of view, even though you're developing characters in another society? How much was that part of your... Or how much does it play into what you do?
Do you want to?
Sure, yeah. As one of the most interesting bits of feedback I've had from Chechens who have read my novel has been a number of them have said that they were glad that an American, that a Westerner, that somebody with no stakes in this conflict wrote this novel about it, because they assumed that as an outsider I wouldn't have a particular horse in this race, that it wouldn't be biased in the way that they perceived their own work would be considered biased by outside observers, in the way that they considered Russian work biased, and that by being this third party, I was considered somehow removed from that.
I think we have time for just one more question. Yes, right here.
So you've talked about a wide range looking at conflict, from why a society implodes, what happens when a war ends, to somebody trying to recreate their village long after it's ended, and also Afghanistan, where we're sort of at the tail end of a war and about to leave. So what are any positive lessons learned that come from the experience of your characters? I say this as someone who works in peace building to try and understand what is a common connection of the dots here.
Well, I'm not sure as a writer. I mean, I think we're natural-born pessimists. I'm not sure if we have an optimistic message for you. I think we tend to examine that side of the human condition far more. But one of the reasons I was drawn to write about Croatia, as I said, was the similarities between Croatia and Sierra Leone. But one of the other reasons, one of the things that struck me also was the differences between the two wars. And the biggest one, I would say, is the former Yugoslavia's great difficulty in overcoming the conflict. And in Sierra Leone, there has been a much, I mean, sometimes I just put it like this: Sierra Leoneans have committed the greatest act of forgiveness that I think I've ever witnessed. They really have, and to the extent, I mean, this is something I observed myself, it's something I thought about and wrote about, and the reason there's two reasons I think it is. One is that our war never went down ethnic lines, so there was never the other. Whereas when you go to Croatia and you hear people talk about the Serbs, there is the other, and of course the other is no longer there. So we couldn't other anybody else, and people really had to own, people really had to own what we had done. But the second thing is Sierra Leone does have a very big forgiveness culture. These are small communities, they're farming communities, people live together and until recently didn't travel that far away. They're also exogamous, so everybody is related to everybody else. But a lot of people who've done work on reconciliation, most of the reconciliation that's taken place has actually been done by local people. The big things, the big TRC wasn't what achieved it. It was actually done by local people, local initiatives. And I was recently asked to go to Kosovo later this year to speak on that very thing. What lessons in reconciliation can Kosovo take from Sierra Leone? And I have a friend out there who's a psychiatrist, and he has spoken on this at length. I was in Sri Lanka, and there was a psychologist there going to Sierra Leone, and she said, we want to figure out the secret of your success. So, I think what I say is I ask a question in my novels. I raise a question. I don't always get the answer. It's a journey, but I think what I try and do as a journalist, as a writer, is look at things differently. Turn them upside down. I think to make that connection between Sierra Leone and Croatia is perhaps something certainly. No journalist I know ever made that connection, and a lot of them read my book afterward and said, wow, now I see it. It's a different way of thinking. It's turning things around.
So on that note of forgiveness, I'm going to close our panel, but just remind you to please be sure to visit the book sale table following the event. It's outside. And thank you very much for coming today, and thank you to our guests for this interesting discussion.